Is America's destiny sealed? And is it a destiny that brings peril to Americans? Does prayer still matter? Does prayer on behalf of America still matter? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt discussion. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And I want to give you a heads up real quick that if you are a regular Bold and Blunt listener, first off, thank you so much for your support. If you're not a regular Bold and Blunt listener, but you would like to be, you can find Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com under the podcast menu. And you can find it now on Edify, edify.app/podcasts. What's Edify, you ask? Well, Edify is the platform to go to if you're interested in hearing, in listening to, in edifying yourself with faith-based podcasts. And I'm very happy to announce that Bold and Blunt is now part of their regular lineup. And speaking of faith-based podcasts, today's podcast is different from, I think, any and all other podcasts that I've ever done, because for the very first time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I've been doing Bold and Blunt for a little over 2 years, or maybe hitting right at 2 years now. But I believe in Bold and Blunt history, I have never had a podcast where I have had the entire episode devoted to an interview with a guest. And today's guest has proven so interesting that our discussion went on for the full segment of Bold and Blunt. And really, we could have chatted for, I'm sure, another hour on this topic. So hopefully he'll be a repeat guest. But today's podcast is simply my interview with my special guest, Matt Lohmeier. He is the author of the best-selling Irresistible Revolution, Marxism, Goal of Conquest, and The Unmaking of the American Military. Irresistible Revolution. I know you are going to want to check out this book. And if you want to check out Matt Lohmeier himself, he is the fired U.S. Space Force commander. I'm sure you've heard of him. If you haven't, you're going to hear of him today, and you're going to be intrigued and want to hear even more of him. So let me give his website real quick. It is MatthewLohmeier.com. MatthewLohmeier.com. Go there. He's author, speaker, defender of American freedoms, defender of the Constitution, defender, even more importantly, of religious principles, of all things godly, of biblical teaching. So Matt is here. Thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Happy to be here with you. Thank you.
So let's talk first your background, because for people who follow Fox News and Newsmax and other conservative type sites, they may be aware of who you are, but just in case, there you were just a few months ago, Lieutenant Colonel of the 11th Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Space Base, that's a mouthful, in Colorado. Can you start by explaining what is a Space Warning Squadron?
Right, yeah. So just also briefly by way of background, I had spent over 15 years in the Air and Space Force, and most of my time in the Air Force I had spent initially flying jets. I was an F-15 pilot and had flown over 1,200 hours in both the F-15C and the T-38 as an instructor pilot. And after I was in the flying career field, I transitioned into what was then Air Force Space Command. Air Force Space Command was the command within the Department of the Air Force that was largely responsible for the Defense Department's military space assets. And in the aftermath of the stand-up of a new independent Space Force in December of 2019, that Air Force Space Command, with all of its capabilities and personnel, seamlessly transitioned into the new Space Force. And so the unit that you've mentioned, the 11th Space Warning Squadron, that I was in command of, was one of two space-based missile warning units where we have infrared satellites in geosynchronous orbit, over 20,000 miles from the Earth, that are actually constantly persistently imaging the Earth with infrared sensors in order to detect heat signatures on the Earth so that we can provide detection of and warning of missile launches that might threaten U.S. troops or our allies. And the two space-based missile warning units that do that mission happen to be stationed out of Colorado, which is where I was last stationed.
So there you were, happily providing national security of utmost importance to Americans, and then you go on this podcast and pick it up from there. What happened?
Right. Well, I think it's important to necessarily go back a few months and say that ever since I had taken command in the summer of 2020 of that space-based missile warning unit, I had seen, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, left-wing social justice activism, and there's no other way of putting it, that was kind of permeating military life. And, young people that sign up to serve and wear the uniform of their country don't sign up to join a politicized organization. They should be able to focus on whatever mission it is that they've been asked to accomplish without politicization. That's the beauty of an apolitical military, is that it doesn't matter your politics. You lay that at the doorstep to do a certain mission for national security purposes. And I had at my Colorado an activist-based commander who all of it daily peddling political narratives about American history and systemic racism and so forth, and imposed those narratives upon service members at his base. And so the interview that you mentioned, which took place in May of 2021, was only that came only after publishing a book about Marxism and about critical race theory. The book is called Irresistible Revolution, and that book only came and was written after I had used and exhausted the channels available to me as a commander in the armed forces. I used my chain of command to essentially formally lay down grievances that I wanted to bring to their attention and explain to them how this kind of indoctrination was undermining good order and discipline and the morale of our troops. And then I even filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office of the Space Force, detailing and writing some of what I was seeing and explaining how it was tied to Marxist-rooted critical race theory. And so after having written a book about it, because I wasn't making traction otherwise, I did a podcast. I know that was a mouthful to lead up to that point, but I think that's necessary background. I did a podcast. It was a 30-minute interview in which I described the contents of the book and also described the phenomenon of social justice activism that was sweeping across the military, and some of the same violent impulse, in fact, that we saw sweeping the country in 2020, smashing windows and violating other civil rights. Some of that spirit as well is actually showing up in kindly rhetoric in what we call diversity and inclusion trainings in the military. And it wasn't just apparent to me. I mean, I was having young people come to my office and complaining about these trainings and saying that they felt like our workplace was being politicized, or they didn't appreciate what was being foisted upon them as service members. And so this became a pretty big problem. And I just happened to be one of the first people I was aware of, anyways, to be willing to confront it head on and speak up about it, write about it. And in fact, it's generated quite a bit of energy around these topics, and the nation's been kind of abuzz talking about these topics, and the Defense Department has actually received quite a bit of congressional scrutiny ever since my book was published. I think it's important to have these conversations.
Because by and large, the military, even today, as much as the left hates to admit it, even today, the military is mostly leaning on the conservative side of things. So when you start talking about anti-American issues as the military is putting forth nowadays, it really strikes a chord. But many in the military, as you pointed out, are a little bit afraid to speak out because you don't give up your First Amendment freedoms in the military, but it is harder to exercise them because there are more walls to jump and there are more punitive measures. Right. So for you to come forward, your motivation first and foremost, it wasn't fame, it wasn't fortune, right? You wanted to raise an issue that was apparent to you, degrading the spirit of the military, yes?
Absolutely. The idea that someone would do what I've done for fame or fortune is silly once people start to recognize exactly what my actions cost me.
Yes.
I wrote the book in my free time on my own dime and time because I had a full-time job as a commander, which I loved, by the way, and I couldn't have anticipated that the Space Force would then, after it fired me on May 14th, it leaked to the press a story saying it had lost its trust and confidence in my ability to be a leader in the Space Force, which effectively derailed my leadership potential in the service. And then I spent several months waiting for a supposed investigation to unfold, which I never heard anything about while I was active duty, until the point at which I requested an early retirement because I had essentially been moved to a separate, segregated office on the base where I didn't have any interaction with any of my old troops. And for 3 months I sat there. My wife and kids and I lived on the base, and people were afraid to talk to my wife even because they didn't want stigma of having associated with the wife of the recently fired commander who might be a racist or a white supremacist, heaven forbid, and so I'm not going to associate with that family. So we waited for 3 months. I requested an early retirement. That was denied me, and we separated on the 1st of September of this year. And so, yeah, to think that someone did this to either get fame or riches is a little bit absurd. What I did do it for was because I love the country. I love the men and women who serve in uniform and think they don't deserve a politicized work environment. There's great reason why they've been asked to be apolitical. And, the interview that you pointed out that I did, the first podcast I had done in early May about my book, I was very careful not to criticize the current, the Biden administration. I was careful not to criticize my own chain of command. Those things are punishable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and rather, instead even, I was complimentary of my chain of command and gave them the benefit of the doubt because I did respect them a great deal. And so there is a way to go about these things. I think I did that very carefully. You don't lose your First Amendment rights as a service member, although you are subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which does prohibit you from exercising your freedom of speech in ways that would criticize elected officials and so forth. But I hope that service members learn that, in looking at what's happened with me, that yes, sometimes there's tough consequences when you choose to speak up. But if it's worth it to you to defend your oath, to support and defend the Constitution, and speak up in its defense, and speak up in defense of the preservation of your liberties, you're willing to accept tough consequences when it truly matters. And because this stuff truly matters, we're frankly facing the continued denigration of morale in our military, and ultimately even the loss of our liberty forever in this country if people don't start speaking up and putting their neck on the line.
And I want to get to talking about your love for America and the roots of that love for America. But first, I want to, could you give your book title again? Because I want people to actually read what you've written and decide for themselves whether you deserved the treatment that you received from America's military and the slandering of your name as advancing white genocide, conspiracy theory, and all the other creations and fabrications that the left could come up with. So what's the full title of your book again, and where can people get it?
The full title of the book is Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. And the can be found most easily on my website, MatthewLohmeier.com. And I've linked to a bunch of different online retailers on the website, and some of your listeners may or may not like me saying so, but right now the best, cheapest place to get the book is on Amazon, and they must have bought like 1 trillion copies of the book a few months back that they're now trying to purge from the shelves. And so they set the pricing there, not me. I don't care where people buy the book. I simply want them to read it and get the information. But I mean, hardback on Amazon's like $10 right now, which is very that's a low price. And they can also buy customized signed copies of my book on my website, MatthewLohmeier.com, right now, which I'm offering for a season here.
And this is important stuff because the cultural Marxist takeover of the military is being experienced just in civilian society across America now. So much of the information that you put forth in your book actually plays out to the civilian sector as well. And let's talk about your love for America, because I know from listening to you in the past that your love for America is rooted in the idea of America's greatness comes from God, not so much government, but the idea of God-given rights.
Yeah, well, that was the understanding of our founders as well. When I went off to school at the Air Force Academy back in 2000, I don't think I was extremely patriotic. I don't think I had strong love of the country. I did love the country, but it was something that I actually grew into. I went there to play basketball, I mean, I was a young basketball player, and it was only after I really decided to give history a serious study, and I hadn't done that in high school by any means, but I became an avid student of history, not necessarily political philosophy or political history per se, although there was that too. But just simply studying history and studying human nature and past empires, civilizations, and so forth, I really grew to love what it was that our founders envisioned and tried to accomplish in the founding of this great nation. I really do believe it could not have been successfully accomplished without the hand of Providence, to use George Washington's common word. And it was a common word among the founders, and that meant something to them. The hand of Providence guided this all along. There has been, in my view, no greater experiment in human government that we've ever seen on the planet than what we have been up to for the past couple of centuries in the American government experiment. But there's a lot. I'm oversimplifying because this government's become a whole bunch that it was never intended to be. The bureaucracy of this country at the moment is just overwhelming, and so there's an ideal, and that's why I call it in my book the greatness of the American ideal, because the ideal was superb, and by and large, that ideal and the American founding philosophy have helped humans in this country for a very long time find their best, bring out the best in themselves and in others in their communities. And there's a reason the trajectory of American history has been so positively blessed. It's because of the divinely inspired ideal. Now, naturally then, when you've got a Marxist-rooted narrative of American history, one of the first things that narrative and its purveyors will attempt to do is to undermine the American citizen's mind or belief in the nobility of its own inheritance and history, because if you can divorce the American psyche from the greatness of its own history, then you can begin to teach it all sorts of things. I mean, you can lie to the American people about what this country was, is, and should be, and even inspire in them the belief that a violent revolution is necessary to overturn old society and bring about something that's better, something that's utopian, something that's statist, and remake American society so we're a better player on the global stage. But all of that's a fantasy, and it will only return our country to its pre-American the tribal roots of a global society, where people break off into tribes and fight for their own survival and for their own best interests. And so we've really had something great here, and it requires people speaking up boldly now if we're going to preserve it.
Matt, I know our time is just about run out, but do you have time for one more question?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, because this really is, to me, this is the biggest question that I'm asking you today. When I heard you speak a few months ago, you made a comment. You made a very remarkable comment about prayer in America and how Americans pray, especially during political campaigns. And I may be deviating a little bit from your main point, but the overall theme of what you were getting at was that you can pray for America, but sometimes what you're praying for may seem to go unanswered because you are living the consequences, or another way of putting it, living the sin of what you have already laid in place as an American. So God may not magically come down and give you the wish that your prayer is asking for. Could you flush that out a little bit? I'm not sure. Do you remember the remarks you were making?
Oh. Yeah, well, I said it a number of different ways, probably in a number of different venues, and so I can't remember exactly how I might have said it there, but I can talk to this issue.
It's huge.
But I'll say first, how long do I have?
You know what? Take as long as you want, because this is huge. This is a very crucial issue for America.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you've said that this is perhaps the bigger of the questions that you've asked, the biggest of the questions, because these matters are the biggest matters. And I speak all around the country to conservative groups, and based on my own observation, largely speaking, these conservative groups are populated by, to some degree, to a large degree, Christians. Or the people who believe in the Judeo-Christian tradition. These are prayerful people. I've had a lot of people pray over me. I've had a lot of people mention that they're praying for me, or that they're praying for their leaders in our country, and I think all of that's necessary and good. And so I wouldn't, the way you've teed this up, I wouldn't say, that's not useful. I think that God expects people to be prayerful and to exercise their faith. But there is something to the idea, too, in principle of you reap what you sow. There's something there's principles involved here that God isn't going to, in my opinion, wave a magic wand and fix our problems because we've decided in our moment of desperation to wake up to the awful dilemma that we currently face.
Right.
And in desperation, we reach out asking Him to fix our problems. I mean, we've been asleep at the wheel for a long time.
Yep.
Now, what I want to say is, and I've said this a number of places as well, unfortunately, most nations recognize their peril just a little bit too late. So the fact that conservative Christian people in this country are waking up to their peril, and I mean that quite literally, either is an indication that we've been granted a special dispensation of grace from the God of heaven to actually repent and get things straight, or it's indicative of the fact that it's just a bit too late. So you study Bible history, you study the history of people all over. I mean, you've got people, they get prayerful and when they get desperate. You look at ancient Israel, in their moment of desperation. I could get into this for a very long time, and so maybe we'll have a separate conversation about this as well. But I don't, whether you're talking about the encroachment of the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, or the encroachment of the Babylonians in the beginning of the 6th century BC, people become desperate when they're faced with their demise. And no matter how many good people started praying and hoping and trying to become active and involved, if the cards are set, if the table is set. There's a certain outcome that's in the works. It doesn't matter what you might do to stop that from coming. But I also want to emphasize, having said that I don't want anyone to think that their voice doesn't matter. I don't want anyone to think their prayers don't matter. In fact, I'm convinced that even the voice of one person can make a tremendous difference in world affairs or in a nation's affairs.
Absolutely.
And, even in the smallest realms, if you don't have a big sphere of influence, your voice matters to that sphere of influence in which you've been planted. If you have a large sphere of influence and you get to speak around the country or something, or you've got a show like or a podcast like you and others, your voice can carry a bit further. Your voice matters a great deal because there are people listening, and you don't know who you'll touch and what actions they'll take in order to preserve liberty or to turn the spirit of a country back towards God. But I'll be perfectly blunt with you. I'm hesitant to say this kind of thing publicly usually, but I can't help but wonder if our destiny is a bit sealed at the moment based on how we've acted and how we are acting. And so.
No, that's exactly it. That's exactly the message people need to hear.
And you know what? And if that's true, it doesn't mean you give up and you don't fight. If that's true, it means you go down on the right side of history, fighting to preserve liberty and being a faithful human.
Yep.
And so, you need to, even if you believe like I do, that maybe our destiny is sealed, and somehow that's a part, too, of an overarching grand plan, you fight for liberty, you get the spirit, you pray earnestly, and you do all that you can wherever you're planted to do what's right and to help people along. And don't give others a reason to be angry with you, and don't give them a reason to fight you. They're going to fight and be angry anyway. You be noble and you be true. And this is a minor struggle we're involved in the eternal scheme of things. And so we got to get this right. And then you march forward, onward, upward, gaining in truth and light, and trying to be a force for good in the cosmos. Because this is, you're planted here for a reason at this time. It doesn't mean you're going to win the fight, but you fight the battle nobly.
So that one day, if you're a Christian, you believe that you will hear from Jesus in heaven, that good job, that good and faithful servant. And just to add to your point about being a small voice, God actually seeks out small voices. David was a small voice. Yes. Gideon was a small voice. So it's the small voices that God actually looks for. So you're right on that point. No voice is too small.
We're approaching Christmas season, and we commemorate the birth of the Savior at the Christmas season, but it's interesting if you look at the Gospels. This is turning into a religious discussion. I kind of like it. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, it's the important discussion.
Well, if you look at the Gospels and you look at the way in which the birth of the Savior is reckoned there's a reference to Augustus Caesar and to other political leaders, because at the time, in the context in which this all-important person is born, he was born into obscurity. I mean, there were wise men that were aware and looking forward to the time of his coming, but the Jews didn't even recognize that he had come. And so the mightiest of all who came into the world in obscurity has to even have political leaders mentioned by name in order to reckon the time and place of his birth. God works through small means oftentimes, and it's not until after the fact, when people or the history books are written, that people recognize the ways in which God accomplishes purposes. But most of the people we read about today and take for granted as being great and important parts of God's plan in human history were simply obscure in their own day. I mean, Abraham and his sons were wandering travelers, a very small band of family, and it's from them that covenants are established and the God of heaven does his work on the earth. But anyway, I digress and say that all of that to say I really am a believer in the fact that people, no matter where they're planted, have an obligation to try and be true to themselves and be true to God. And that's what the founders did. In fact, they were noble men. These were noble men who believed in what they were doing, and they laid a groundwork for us to have a very successful experiment in human governance. And there seem to be people who I call domestic enemies who are just bent on undoing all of that. And we need to fight back. We need to fight them in every way that we possibly can.
And I actually think it helps to look at what goes on in this world through the eyes of biblical teachings, because then it keeps you fighting on against principalities instead of fighting the whack-a-mole political battles, right? I mean, that's kind of how it makes it easier to see the field.
Yeah, we don't wrestle against flesh only. We're wrestling against the principalities and powers of darkness in high places. And boy, even if you're not a Christian, you kind of start recognizing that's true as you watch what's unfolding in this country under the current administration.
Absolutely. And Matt, I'm sorry to have taken so much of your time, but this is I think this is the good conversation to have, the one that people need to hear. And I would love to have you back to talk further about biblical truths.
Oh, sure.
Okay. But in the meanwhile, your book, I know it's got to be a bestseller now, is it?
It is. It was, well, at the moment it's not a bestseller, but it was a bestseller. I think probably around 100,000 copies have sold.
Good for you.
It's a self-published book, so for a self-published book, I mean, besides, like, the atrocious 50 Shades of Grey, I think it's done better than many self-published books. And, yeah, so I've been grateful. The word is getting out. I still have service members even reaching out, telling me they just heard about the story, that they bought the book, and they're looking forward to read it, and they thank me for writing it because they're recognizing that it's time for us to take a stand. And, and for these service members, I want it to be clear to your listener, I'm very conservative, I'm Christian, but whether or not your service members are Republican, Democrat, Christian or not, they just simply don't want a politicized military environment. They just don't. And right now we've got a very one-sided left-wing politicization of our military taking place. And that disincentivizes people of all races, religious or non-religious backgrounds, and of both sides of the political aisle.
Yeah, national security. It should be the one place that Democrats, Republicans can come together on a nonpartisan basis. So I thank you for writing the book, and I thank you for the work you do on behalf of America. Matt Lohmeier, thank you for being on Bold and Blunt. Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Merry Christmas. Yeah, Merry Christmas to you. Thank you.
The left is simply trying to do to the military what they did to higher schooling, what they did to academia in America. They're trying to turn it from an environment where critical thinking was encouraged, even fostered, into an environment of obey at all costs and obey the leftist belief system at all costs, which requires, by and large, the removal of all things God. And as Matt pointed out, that's not what founding fathers wanted for this nation. And let me just say, what Matt was referring to, the reluctance he had in bringing up a certain view of his own, that America may indeed have reached the point of no return, that in America our fate may already be sealed, no matter how much prayer is going on right now to save us from socialism, to save us from cultural Marxism, to save us from enemies, foreign and domestic. That point of view is actually shared by me. I had, and I've said on this podcast, and I've written about, and I've spoken about in other settings, that I actually looked at the Obergefell versus Hodges opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court, the one that ushered in this government stamp of approval, forced stamp of approval for gay marriage, as a point in time where God withdrew his blessings and protection on America, at least withdrew some of them. I remember when that ruling came out, and I had this physical thud in my stomach that this is it. This is the point where America has turned our backs on God fully, completely. And this is the point where God was going to, basically, to use the phrase that Matt brought up about reaping what we sow. There's a principle in the Bible: you can't mock God. And yes, there is solid rationale to continue praying for our nation. It's not over. It's not over until it's over. And I believe fully that Christians have no cause to ever abandon America. Because without Christians, this nation is lost. If this nation was founded on the idea of rights coming from God, not government, then you need godly people, making sure that that provision stays in place. And remember, if you want a real optimistic, biblical-based truth about the idea that even if you believe this nation's best days are behind her, that you should still continue praying, think of Nehemiah. Read the stories of the Bible. Read the books of the Bible. I'm not going to get into Nehemiah and all those principles. Give you something to read this weekend. Give you something to read going into the coming year. But for those who think about losing hope for America, there is Nehemiah. Thank you for listening. I want to remind you, if you want to get bold and blunt, you can do so at all your podcasting platforms, including edify.app/podcast. It is the platform for faith-based podcasts. Or, of course, you can go to WashingtonTimes.com, find Bold and Blunt there, and subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter filled with all my commentaries as well as my twice weekly podcast. The newsletter comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's delivered right to your email box, so you don't even have to go searching for it. And within will be my Tuesdays and Thursdays podcasts. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.